Welcome back. This video will cover Module 3 of the course, which is on the government and fiscal policy. So going back to our first module where we introduced the supply and demand model, we didn't go too much into detail about shifts of supply and demand, the model itself. We sort of just introduced what demand and supply were. Talked a little bit about why they're shaped the way they were. If you can remember, supply is upward sloping, meaning that at higher prices, there's a higher quantity supplied. Generally, demand downward sloping, meaning that at higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. Consumers like to purchase when things are cheaper. So the reason, or one of the reasons that we introduced this model at the beginning of the course is that aggregate demand and aggregate supply, modeling demand and supply for an entire economy, is one of the main justifications of the government and the use of what we call fiscal policy. This is especially relevant within the last year. The new Biden administration has pushed for a number of what we would call fiscal policy packages, including government spending and transfer programs, mostly in response to COVID-19. So we'll talk in this section about one potential justification for government intervention, what the government intervention looks like, and we'll talk also about critiques of this type of fiscal government intervention. Oops. Back. Right. So in Keynesian theory, there's some long-run level of production which makes efficient use of the resources and technologies we have available within our economy. You can think of this sort of like the PPF. The PPF showed all of the points which were efficient uses of our resources, the inefficient uses, the unattainable resource uses, and right on the frontier were efficient. Right, so there's some long-run efficient level. And in the short run, the equilibrium, which is the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So this intersection could be too low, meaning output is too low, or it could be potentially too high, meaning our output is too high. Right, so if real output is lower, then this sort of long-run efficient level, that is what we call an depression. And if it's higher, we get a period of economic growth. All right, so what we think about, connecting that then to our second unit on the inflation and unemployment question, we tend to think that there's also some sort of trade-off between inflation and unemployment, such that, once again, referring to this graph, if this point is too high, if we're producing too much too fast, there's inflation. But if this point is too low, real output, real GDP is too low, we're producing too little, and there will be unemployment. So the Keynesian justification for fiscal policy and government intervention is to mediate this aggregate demand and aggregate supply equilibrium, trying to keep it basically as close to this sort of hypothetical long-run level where we're efficient and using as many of our resources as possible. Right, so in this theory, the role of government is to balance the trade-off between inflation and unemployment by keeping GDP and price level growth stable, or in other words, moderating this equilibrium. Right, so one more time, why do they want to do that? Well, if real output, if GDP is too low, that usually means unemployment, which is bad for people. If real output GDP is way too high, sometimes we get inflation or too high prices. That can be bad for certain people. Right, so the role of the government, once again, to moderate this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So here we see sort of the two possibilities. Ignore curve 2 for a moment if you can. Suppose that we have an intersection here between our aggregate demand curve 1, or this original aggregate demand, and our short-run aggregate supply. Right, suppose this intersection is below this long-run efficient level. All right, so this long run aggregate supply mark here, this is basically just saying, all right, suppose in the long run, we were using all of our resources efficiently. This is how much we could produce, this certain real GDP marked right here. So this original intersection right here, aggregate demand 1 and short run aggregate supply, we can see that real GDP is too low. Right? We could be more efficient in producing this long run level. When GDP is too low, then we get unemployment, and it might be reasonable for the government to implement what we call expansionary fiscal policy, which increases aggregate demand so that the intersection is at this long run efficient level. Right? On the other way, suppose we've got this aggregate demand 1, its intersection with the short run aggregate supply, in this case, is higher than the long run level. So here at this intersection, we're producing too much. What's the problem with producing too much? Traditionally, you might get inflation. So if price levels are too high, certain people can't afford necessary goods. That's bad for overall well-being. And then the Keynesian policy is, well, we can reduce aggregate demand so that the intersection coincides with this long-run level. What are the fiscal policy options? You've got tax, government spending, and transfers. Income transfers might be like Social Security programs, food stamps, other types of distribution programs like that. So generally speaking, putting more money into people's pockets through government distribution programs would be transfer programs. All right, so expansionary policies, I'm not going to test really on how to create the shift, but you just need to know basically what are the fiscal policy options. So tax, government spending, and transfers. And then if we wanted this expansionary policy, what would we do to tax? Well, aggregate demand increase. At this point, we're starting to get into kind of the principles of macroeconomic stuff. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but we could increase aggregate demand. We could get people to buy more stuff at every price if we give them more money, essentially. How would we give people more money? Reduce tax, right? Government spending could increase aggregate demand. So increase aggregate demand by increasing government spending. You can increase transfers, give people more money. That would be an aggregate demand increase. You can also contract aggregate demand by increasing tax. So people have less money to spend. They demand less stuff at every price. You could decrease government spending, or you could decrease transfers. Okay, so again, I think I won't test on whether you increase or decrease to get the expansionary or contractionary result. That is a macroeconomics kind of 204 question. I will probably test something like which of the following is not a fiscal policy option. So you just need to know what are the fiscal policies. You'll need to know sort of in general what the idea is. If this intersection is too low, then we want more production, more GDP, so we want higher aggregate demand. If it's too high, we want less so that we don't get inflation. Here, the problem, unemployment. Here, when this intersection is too high, the problem, inflation, too high prices. Right, so I have some more detail about that here. Once again, just I guess I could have gone to these graphs to give my last spiel there, but just to reinforce this, what's going on here? Here's our original aggregate demand. Here's our short run supply. They intersect and it's too low. So the problem with this, unemployment. We could be producing more stuff, so there's some people who could have jobs that don't. Keynesian theory suggests you stimulate aggregate demand using tax cuts, give people more money, increase government spending directly, or direct income transfers, food stamps, child care services, any other type of income program that you can think of. Right, the opposite case, Where's our aggregate demand? 1 here, our short run supply, and then that's too high because it's above or to the right of long run aggregate supply. Right, so here the problem is going to be inflation. Some prices are too high in the economy. In this case, we should reduce aggregate demand by increasing taxes, decreasing government spending, or reducing income transfers. Right, so that is the Keynesian theory. If the aggregate demand supply equilibrium is too high or too low, we get inflation or unemployment, which the government can counteract. Right. So moving on, why does it work? Especially, these government spending or income transfer programs. Why will they create this shift in aggregate demand that results in getting back to the efficient level? This is what we call the multiplier process, and generally holds that if the government spends or invests $1 into the economy, more than $1 will be spent throughout the economy. So, for instance, suppose the government spends $1 on schools, the direct government spending will increase aggregate demand or GDP by $1. But then some of that is going to be spent by the school. So the school gets an extra dollar, they turn around, they spend it on something, maybe teachers, supplies. When that school spends some of that dollar, GDP has now increased by more than $1. It's increased by $1 plus however much of that additional dollar that these schools spent. Once those schools spend money, it changes hands. Those people spend some of the dollar and so on. And so we ask the question in economics, if one of these people receives one more dollar, how much on average will they spend? And that's what's called the marginal propensity to consume. So if you got one more dollar, how much of that dollar would you spend MPC, or marginal propensity to consume? All right, so this is how the multiplier process works. Every person has some sort of marginal propensity to consume. If they get one more dollar, they'll spend some amount of it. If you give people who are going to spend the dollar, $1, they'll spend it. The money circulates throughout the economy, creating this multiplier process. So that dollar is spent multiple times. Every dollar given to, say, one individual person will be spent multiple times, creating more than a $1 increase in GDP, or aggregate demand. Right? So once again, our marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is just how much the average person, or how much each person will spend of one additional dollar. And then the amount which fiscal policy impacts aggregate demand will depend on this MPC, right? Because if you give the money to people who spend it, it gets spent and circulated in the economy. Conversely, if you were to give money, direct transfers or tax cuts to people who do not spend the money, then the money does not circulate in the economy, does not create this multiplier effect. Right, just to illustrate this, so suppose the government increases spending on schools by $1. Again, I won't ask math questions on your quizzes. You won't have to do any sort of calculation or anything like that. But just to illustrate mathematically why the MPC matters, and why ultimately it kind of matters who you give money to in these sorts of government transfers and spending programs. I suppose we have an MPC of 0.5, so each person who gets the dollar spends 50 cents. Right? Government spends $1, say that at the schools, the teacher turns around and spends 50 cents of their salary, the pencil shop, who then spends 25 cents on wood, and so on down the line. Right? With an MPC of 0.9, the first person spending the dollar spends 90 cents. The second one, no, I didn't do that right. I'll have to change these numbers, because if you had 90 cents and you spent 90% of it, then that's 81 cents and so on. So I'll have to change these numbers. But the point is that it's a higher amount that gets spent each time. And then what would be the point? What would be happen if you gave this dollar to someone with an MPC of 0? Well, they get the dollar, they spend none of it, and then so the impact is $1. Right, so the higher the MPC, the more likely it is the person getting the dollar spends it, the higher is the multiplier process, the more impactful will be increases in government spending. And finally, we've got some critiques of fiscal policy. One critique is that government spending is ineffective because if the government spends money, people will just assume inflation or tax increases in the future. And so it will not have the desired impact on consumers and consumer spending. And the teachers who get the money in the last example from the government spending program won't spend as much of it as the government would like. There's also reason to believe that uh, that people's predictions about future economic states are not entirely accurate. So people might not be good at spending or saving or choosing how to distribute the resources accurately. Government might not be efficient at targeting the spending. So even if, say, on this graph here, right, we know we're short of our efficient level, does the government know exactly how short we are or what will be the exact policy to implement this shift? Probably not. At best, it can estimate. And finally, it's worth mentioning in sort of recent political spheres, you hear talk about socialism and tax. In economics, socialism actually means worker ownership of means of production, or worker ownership of companies. And so economically, that's something different. Politically, I think tax and socialism get kind of mixed in together. But in economics, socialism means worker ownership. And so that's something that we talk a little bit more about in kind of the economic history and some of the other classes. All right, so that's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.